Oh, man, that is a good song. Well, I just play the whole thing and do it over and
Just
over and over again. People will be pretty happy, I
you're
think.
teasing them.
Yeah, I'm teasing. Mike Seminary filling in for Tyler Axness. You'd normally be listening to Afternoons with Tyler, but he's on a well-deserved break, and I'm lucky enough to fill in for him. I have a guest. By the way, I'm going to give you the numbers again because I think during this segment, you're going to probably want to call 237-5948, 1-800-880-5346, or you can text to hashtag KFGO 5346. I have a good friend in the studio with me today, Tom Campbell. Tom, how are you?
Hey, Mike, doing great.
Thank you for giving me this book about your father. Name of the book, Guardian Angel, Personal Memories of World War II. This is over 75 years ago, but he's detailing and sharing his experiences. He was a bombardier pilot for a B-17. By the way, over 50%, I think, is the number of these guys never came back, either because the planes fell apart or they were shot down or they became prisoners of war or whatever. Your dad was a hero, first of all. And I'm glad that Captain Paul E. Campbell was encouraged to write this book along with your daughter, I think.
Mm-hmm.
B-17 Flying Fortress pilot, 401st Bombardier Group, 8th Air Force. Your dad was an incredible note taker, apparently, because this book is amazing, Tom.
He did, and he was, and thanks to my sister Diane Maholka, who I think is listening, she took his memoir papers and turned them into this book. And unfortunately, we didn't get it done in time. He died 2 months before we finished it, but it was his memoir papers, so obviously it was his stuff, so he knew it. But yeah, he was a note taker because back then, you know, how many people from 17 years old to 25 or 26, you know, would do that back then. There was no iPads or phones or anything electronic, so he just did it the old by hand in a wartime. So I commend him for doing that because he shared a lot of things that my sister Diane put in this book that we can value. And thank you for having me for just the appreciation we can give to my dad and all the World War II veterans and all veterans in general, because if it wasn't for people like him, you know, he risked his life, Mike, so you and I could live the American dream, which we did. And if it wasn't for that, we may be speaking German or Japanese. And it was interesting. He always told me, I don't even know if this is in the book or not, but he always said that if it wouldn't have been for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he said we may have lost the war because that was a blessing in disguise, because that kind of got everybody fired up. And, you know, prior to that, a lot of people were against us entering in the Hitler War because they were saying, it's not going to go anywhere. And Joe Kennedy, you know, the ambassador to England, he was against it and strongly encouraged Roosevelt, no, we don't want to fight a war, and on and on. And then the Pearl Harbor, that you know, there was no question after that. It was boom, we declared two wars, one again Japan and then Germany and Hitler. And he said that he heard on the radio stations that back then, probably one radio station in Grafton, that he said, sign up for the war. It's an excellent opportunity for adventure and a chance to see the world. And then he told me that in many cases, it was more than an adventure than they bargained for, because there's so many people, you know, that had died. And you're right. The first 1.5 to 2 years of the war, the B-17 pilots, 50% of them, when they flew the English Channel and bombed, never came back. They were either shot down, you know, POW'd or prisoners of war, or died. And I'll just explain to it. A lot of people don't know the basics. You know, my dad was stationed in Deanthorpe, England, which is about an hour north of London in England. And they would always, that was, you know, United States had an air base there. They would fly the English Channel and they would bomb. At the time, German had control of France. And they would bomb primarily France and German targets. They went to Poland a couple times, but that was a long ways away. The 10.5 hours is a long mission there and back. Many times they would literally almost run out of fuel and some of them didn't even make the runway. And so that's what they'd do. They would, you know, bomb strategic targets. He had, I think, once once for sure, maybe twice to bomb Hitler. They missed, but there was a lot of runways and fuel oils and bridges and things of that nature. But of the 12,000 B-17s that were built, 4,700 of them never made it back. Were shot out, in the air.
Tom, one of the questions I needed to ask you, like my dad never talked. He never really talked about his experience in the service. Other than he told my mom when she wanted to go on a cruise, he pretty much said, "I've been on a cruise. I ain't going on another one." Because when you're on those old ships, they were full of barf. And I'm just being as direct as possible. So Dad never really talked about that stuff. Did your dad talk much about his experiences?
Very little as well, especially the first part of my life, I guess, when we were younger. And then he opened up a little bit. Mr. Jarvis was a history teacher in Grafton, and he asked him to come once or twice and to speak in his class. And Dad reluctantly did. So he opened up a little bit. But as most World War II vets, most of them didn't talk. They had a lot of ugly memories of friends, being blown up, and Dad's got stories of that. And it was ugly. It was a brutal war, and prisoners of war and torturing, and when his buddies, the guardian angel, the name of that is that's his 11th crew member. There's 10 crew members in a traditional B-17 aircraft, and his 11th crew was God, the guardian angel that guarded him, because he had so many close calls of death or planes next to him that were shot down. And it was interesting. And these were his buddies, they were stationed, and half of them, it'd be like if you and I flew to the Frisco Bison football game, and we knew that half us weren't going to come back. How would you feel? It's like, really, Dad? And I asked him once. I said, Dad, were you ever scared? And he goes, nah, we were too. His is word for word. We were too young, dumb, and patriotic. But I think he must have been, or I don't know. But how could you not be when 50% of you were, and a POW in a prison camp where you heard a lot of these stories. These guys would roam around in France, German-controlled territory, and they'd hide in barns. And one of the guys was for 9 months, and finally he got caught. But it's like brutal, starving, and cars would come on the road. They'd run in the trees because they didn't know who it was. And man, to live that life and how they sacrificed is just it's just phenomenal what they went through.
Yeah, so Tom grew up in Grafton, North Dakota, where my mother grew up, and my uncle, who I just went to his funeral, and my grandma and grandpa have been gone a long time. So, and my mom's gone. So the library for us is closed. We can't access, except if I ask somebody like you some questions. Our library is closed. And one of the reasons I'm saying that, if you have loved ones that have served, or done something similar, and you don't know much, ask before the library gets closed. So that leads me to this. When I'm reading this, there's so many names I knew, Tom, because I spent so much time with my grandparents. I'll get to that later. But one of the things your dad, it was incredible how he described this. On those long flights, 6 to 10 hours, he described how they had to relieve themselves in these old, pretty rough, crude planes. It was not a pleasant experience.
Dad always said that Boeing company manufactured these 12,000 planes, and they were virtually flying tin cans.
Well, we're going to hold it right there. Speaking of tin cans, we got to go for a commercial break and pay for this. You're listening to Afternoons with Tyler Axness. I'm Mike Seminary with Tom Campbell. Oh, no, it's Edgar Winter, I think, isn't it? Frankenstein? Oh, what a great song. And Mike Seminary filling in for Tyler Axness. I'm visiting with Tom Campbell, a good friend, and we're talking about a book that his dad, I guess his dad didn't necessarily write it. he had all the notes and their personal memories. Your sister Diane really helped. Guardian Angel, Captain Paul E. Campbell. One of the things that I noticed is so there's during that time there's two theaters. There's the Pacific and Europe, and it was ugly. And your dad shared a lot of the ugly moments, but he would use some of the most interesting phrases that, so for example, you were a prisoner of war. He would say, Tom was a guest. he was a guest of the regime, or a guest of the Germans, or a guest of the Nazis. I found that really interesting because I said to myself, he must also been a really sweet man.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd classify him as that sweet, because he was the greatest generation, which is I think 1901 to 1927. He was born in 1921, and they were old school. With my oldest sister, she always would come home and she was a lovey, touchy feely, and hi Dad, I love you, and Dad would, the old school, would never say I love you. He didn't for many, many years, and finally a few years before he died, my sister tells me the story that she said, I love you, Dad, like she do. And he finally broke loose and he says, me too. And that was a huge step for people that generation, because they just didn't do that. But it is interesting when you comment about my dad, we were talking about the tin can.
Yeah.
Boeing manufactured those. Zero comfort. It was virtually a flying tin can. They sat on a 2x12 for 10 to 10 and a half hours. And when they had to relieve themselves, well, they always stationed it that they had, before they left, they all went to the bathroom, and if they had to go, urinate, that was not a problem, he said, because you just do it in a can and set it behind you. And they were flying. It was 60 below at 12 to 25,000 feet. So that was, and it froze, he says, within 1 minute. But if you had to do the other job, he says, that was a major problem. You just discipline yourself that you never had to. And every now and then was one chapter where one of his co-pilots that had a major deal, and it wasn't pleasant, of the things that you would never think that happened in war, of that nature, the things that you'd think that were minor at the time were major.
I'm chuckling because every once in a while, and he didn't go into great detail, he'd share about how he and a buddy would stop in a pub. And then later on, he'd describe the incident that you just shared. And I said to myself, I don't know if I'd be in a pub. No, or maybe I would, but in terms of controlling myself, I get it. I'm going to entertain myself because I'm going to go on a mission tomorrow. And your dad was a decorated pilot, by the way. I'm going to go on a mission tomorrow. I might not come back, so I get that. But I just think it could be kind of hard to control yourself on a 6, 8, 10, 12-hour flight.
But after a while, they disciplined themselves, or they made sure that it happened once, it didn't happen a second time. So they would eat properly, and they had a schedule of the missions. But getting back to the Pacific and the European Rim, that we were fighting two wars, and of course, Dad was the European one with the German, and it was interesting that I always asked my dad, I says, were you ever scared? And he said, and this is the first and only time he ever commented to me, was that when the 1945, the Germans were losing, the war was over, and then it was they weren't sure what they were going to do, because the Pacific Rim was still, with the Japanese, was still going on, and a lot of people were on hold. Do they need to send all these B-17 planes to the Pacific Rim, Japan, that area, or not? And then of course the big atomic bombs were dropped, and I remember my dad, he was confronted with some people one time about it was terrible that those bombs were dropped. And I remember my dad, I was pretty young at the time, he commented, if it wouldn't have been for those Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs, that saved hundreds of thousands of lives, and the war came to an end. And I'm not promoting that at all, but I'm just telling you what my dad said.
Sure.
Because of that, and because he said that as bad as the German prison camps were and how ugly they tortured, but he says nothing was comparable to the Japanese prison camps. And he says, he never wanted. He always said he had resistance. He would have if he'd had to, but he says, thank God for those two atomic bombs, because he was always scared of being a POW in a Japanese prison camp. Would have been World War III. That would have been ugly, he said.
Yeah, I've read a number of times that people that called, when they compared the two, the European theater was a gentleman's war compared to the Pacific. When we get back, I want to go into some more details about your dad and the relationships and the reunions, all that kind of thing. You're listening to Afternoons with Tyler Axness. This is Mike Seminary filling in with my guest, Tom Campbell, talking about his hero father, Paul Campbell. Oh, man. I'd like to come back every day just to listen to Eric's music. Every single day. I mean, it's not the same listening at home. It's different in here, isn't it?
True.
Yeah. Mike Seminary filling in for Tyler Axness. I'm in studio with my guest, Tom Campbell. We're talking about a book his father wrote, in part with his sister Diane, Guardian Angel, by Captain Paul Campbell, a war hero. He did 2 tours.
Yes, which is very unusual. One tour. Yeah, actually 2 tours. A mission. There's 25 missions per tour, and he did 2 tours, which I think didn't quite finish it. 48 or 49 of the second one, which is unrare because most of them didn't make it. Yeah. The odds, especially that first one, when the first 2 years of the war, was very risky.
Was it in between those 2? He was on leave. He came back here and he met Marietta?
Yes, he met my mother, and then he always says that after the war, he started his most important mission. That was raising 7 kids and getting married, and she was a war bride. There's hundreds of thousands of men, from 1945 to 48 or 49 that got married after the war, and the baby boomers.
Refresh my memory. How old was he when he enlisted?
Well, he was born March 1921, and he was a little older than average. He was, I think. He'd have been I'm 41, he'd have been 20, so he'd have been 21, 22, and 23 when he was there, roughly, give or take. So.
And the average age I think the average age of a pilot was like 20. So,
no, the average age of a pilot was like 25 or 26, because a lot of them came from the academies, and they were educated. My dad never went to college, but he took a college exam, and he clept out of that. So he got his college degree, in essence, kind of back then it wasn't online, but it was just like online. It was correspondence. They took it through correspondence, they called it. And so I think he did it in a year and a half. So he kind of, in essence, got his college degree. So that's why he got into, because to be a captain or a pilot, you have to come from a schooling or part of that. So he kind of bypassed that. And he always said it was a lot of just common sense questions in the test, but so he became a pilot, and he never became a pilot before. And when he came back, he never flew again, hardly at all, for many, many years, until him and my mother did a little bit of traveling, but they drove everywhere because he just didn't. Bad memories of the war. He just didn't want to get back in a plane. Oh. Some of his buddies became, Hod Hudson and Grafton had started their air spray, crop dusting services, but not my dad.
I totally understand it. I mean, the other thing he detailed, which I really appreciated, was after the reunions they'd participate in, they would travel the country. I don't know how organized they were. Obviously, somebody was organizing them, but he would go into great detail about, we met here in Germany, where we met here, and then here's what this person was doing after. And I just need to share one of the stories because I thought it was fascinating. Delbert Wong. Delbert was the first judge in the continental United States that was of Chinese descent, and he was a bombardier pilot. He was the first of Chinese descent to graduate from Stanford Law. And then when he and his wife wanted to buy a home, the realtor didn't want to work with them. But he fixed that right away, considering that he became a judge. But this guy became a legend in the practice of law in California, and your dad and Delbert knew each other. It's just fascinating.
Those reunions we went as a family. My 2 oldest sisters, Jeannie and Carol, have gone now since my dad's passed away many years ago. They still go because most of the veterans, World War II veterans, are passed away. And a lot of the next generation has continued to keep 'em on. But we went one time when they dedicated the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., and that was kind of cool. It was like red carpet treatment. And that was the only reunion I went to. And yeah, it was the memories they had. And Dad used to drive a lot across the country, and he'd always go out of his way to stop at his old buddies in the war that he hadn't seen probably for 30, 40, or 50 years. And he had all kinds of stories. One, I don't remember the names, but it was in the book, or he told us that when another plane would be shot down, and they always had to fly in their squadrons. That was very strong discipline, and many times for 10 hours, if you weren't the lead pilot, you had to follow the wing behind you, specific formation, so the Japanese fighter pilots couldn't attack you as easily. There's a science to that, and if you weren't the lead pilot, you'd have to spend 10 hours sometimes keeping your wing 1 or 2 feet at 12,000 feet, flying 170 miles an hour, from touching it. And so that's all you did. It was no fun, he said. And it was no autopilot. It was no fun at 60 below, half of you being shot down, And he said, yeah, we were there seeking, to experience these adventures of life. And he said it was more than a lot of ventured out. But he said when one of the planes, half of them would get shot down, they'd see it right there, of course, and they would always look to see how many chutes came out, because there's 10 crew member per plane. And he said a lot of times they'd see 7, and then that meant that 3 guys didn't make it, that died, and then of course the 7 that were, they were POW, and sometimes they didn't make it, or sometimes they're half dead flying, down in a parachute. But I always found that interesting, that they would look to see how many chutes opened. It's like, wow, that's like how many buddies are alive. I always found that really interesting when he said
and then
that.
he'd go into detail about how difficult it was to get out of the plane. It was not easy. And maybe that's one of the reasons they count it, because you know the number of chutes, and if there's a way to get to that plane, because they're in there. Because, by the way, there was a little bit of a maverick in your dad. He like the movie Maverick, where they a couple of times flew. How can I say this? Let's just put it out of formation, and I really enjoyed reading that about your father.
Well, at training school and stuff, they would do that a couple times. They would fly over some, cattle farmers and and then they flew under some bridges. They did some things that they shouldn't have did. But hey, if 17 to 24 years old, gone for 3.5 years, I'm sure that they did a lot of things that aren't in a lot of books that we'll never know what happened.
I appreciated how he would describe some of the targets. It wasn't about people. It was about this factory or these roads or this critical infrastructure. If they could take it out, that could make a huge difference in the war and eventual victory. But he never talked about people. He talked about the targets that they needed to take out in terms of infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Ball bearing plants, refineries, manufacturing plants, airplanes, and things like that. But he also did say that when they bombed, they knew there were a lot of people's lives were lost, but they just didn't dwell on that because you couldn't, because the pain and the torture. But it's war. When you're at war, it's just horrible time, and it's unfortunate that a lot of things happen that normally wouldn't happen. But it's interesting when getting back to those POWs. He said in Germany, if you're a lot of these POWs, you were glad to see the German war people take you as prisoners, because a lot of the civilians there would shoot you because they thought we were the bad people and we had been destroying their crops and bombing and stuff. And so a lot of the civilians were tougher than that. So, in Germany as a POW, you were confused. You couldn't speak their language, and you're wondering you couldn't go to a guy's house because most of them didn't like us. So you almost were glad to see a German soldier take you as a prisoner, because then at least you had a chance of surviving, which is kind of amazing.
When I read your dad's book, I couldn't help but reflect on other really best-selling books I've read about war, Greatest Generation, Flags of Our Fathers. And he, in many ways, wrote similarly with regards to the great challenge, the great sacrifice, and also made it pretty personal because these were your mates, and a lot of them you lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. There's a lot of. It goes into that how the guardian angel, it protected his plane because he was one of the 50% that survived, and he had a lot of close calls where his elevators were shot up in the back of the plane. It allows you to go up or down, and he at the last minute he used his trim tab, which is it's another little at the end of the elevator that you use. It's like a cruise control, and he thought of using that, which is unheard of, and that saved him, saved her life. It was one of his close calls he had of many. But the biggest thing of the guardian angel was the fact that he was never shot down. It was always the other plane that was killed or missing in action or POW'd. So
how did he meet Marietta?
He met her back in Grafton when he was on leave, and then he wrote a lot of letters. My dad was a note taker and a writer and stuff, and he wrote a ton of letters, and we actually have a lot of them still that they communicated. And back then, sometimes they read a letter and she wouldn't get it for probably a month or two.
And when we come back from our break, we'll see if we can get a couple calls, and there's a couple other questions I have, but feel free to share anything you like. I'm visiting with Tom Campbell, Mike Seminary, filling in for Tyler Axness. I'm going to read a couple of segments from the book. In peacetime, it had been known as the liner United States, now converted to a troop ship for 20,000 men. And then I go down. What a joke that turned out to be, with 80% of the passengers being seasick. So much of this seasickness occurred while in the chow line. One ERP could be followed by 40 more. What a mess. He should have been wearing a rubber suit, or at least depends, because he was an absolute stinking mess. He is not too eager for my recanting this odor episode at reunions because we still get nauseated at the thought of it. So, Tom, begs the question. Your dad must have upped for a second tour. Why do you think that was?
And I just text my sister, we don't know, because I think technically you only had to fly one tour, which is 25 missions, which is hardly anybody even lasted that long. So, and he's never mentioned it. Nobody knows. And I guess, I don't know. I'm going to have to find out. But my sister, who knows more than all of us put together, she doesn't know either. So I do not know that. That's interesting. But I think he was pretty patriotic, and he came back over after his 15 days. He took a boat home for his R&R. That's when he met my mother. And I just think that he was a captain. He was a senior, and he ended up leading some of the squadrons. And I think he was probably well-liked because he was one of the older ones and mature ones. There's a lot of young people coming in to replace the people that passed away. And I probably just maybe his seniority and experience just wanted to stick around. I don't know.
We kind of opened up this segment. You're making the comment, I'm paraphrasing, that were it not for people like your dad and so many others that served during World War II in the European and Japanese theater, we might not be speaking English. I mean, it was a close call. And as you read some of the very detailed accounts of what was happening at the time, there were times we kind of got lucky. Mm-hmm. But the greatest luck we really all have is that we were blessed with patriotic guys like your dad and so many others that made the decision, after that day of infamy, we need to do something, and he did.
Yep, he said he was just too young, dumb, and patriotic. Not dumb, but he said he was. But yeah, it was, what would we do without him? We'd be speaking German.
Did you ever become a pilot?
Yes, I was a pilot. Yep. Not just a civilian. I never. It was peacetime. It was fortunate for me. I never even had to enlist for the draft because of that 2 times in the history of the United States.
What did he think when you decided to learn how to fly?
Not much. He was kind of a workaholic and old school and stuff, and didn't. I got checked out solo when I was 16th birthday, young age, and I got my license at my son's age, so I was young, and he didn't, not much. He never wanted to come up with me though to fly, and because he just didn't. He had that stigma of he had enough for just the bad memories of it, I think, and I don't know why, but he never wanted to come up and just didn't think much of it.
So we have a caller, Paul, on the line. Hi, welcome to Afternoons with Tyler Axness. Paul, how are you?
I'm excellent. Happy New Year to you guys. Thank you so much for having your guest on, and it's brought back a lot of memories.
I lost that, Eric. Paul, we lost you. I bad connection. Are you still there?
I am still here.
Go ahead.
Hang on.
We got about 30 seconds left. Go ahead.
Okay. My dad was a Navy pilot, World War II in the South Pacific, flew a PBY, and I swear Mr. Campbell was describing my father. Never talked about it, never said I love you, never flew again after the war, and brought back a lot of memories of him. So thank you for that. And thank you for his
Paul.
father's service.
Thank you so much. And Tom, thank you for sharing this story, and thank your sister. It's been a pleasure, folks, filling in for Tyler. Happy New Year to you. We have a lot to be thankful for. Make a difference next year for all those people that you associate with. It's been a pleasure riding with you today.